But welcome to our GCLS virtual events. This is our class family history preparing for the 1950 census. I'm so excited about this class. I was talking with Rachel a little bit before we got started that I've really been looking forward to the 1950 census release. So I'm excited to present to you all today. And if you're interested in future virtual events, please check out our website on our virtual events page or sign up for our e-newsletter. And as Rachel mentioned, we have a program right after this as well. And so if you have any questions during the presentation, if you wouldn't mind typing those in the chat box, we'll have some time at the end where we can answer all of those. And if you haven't already done so, if you wouldn't mind muting while we're doing the presentation, that would be great, just so we don't get any feedback in the background there. And you can just type any questions as we go in the chat. And a link to the class handout will be included in the chat as well. So be sure to look at that too. And so for introductions, my name is Shanna, and I'm the South Carolina Room Supervisor here at the Greenville County Library System, presenting from the Hughes Main Library downtown. And we also have Rachel here. She is our Adult Outreach and Event Coordinator, and she's going to be helping me with moderating the chat and providing links and things like that. So thanks, Rachel. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what we hope to accomplish during this course. So for the class goals today, we're going to discover what types of information can be found in census records, but in particular, we're going to learn all about the specific questions asked in the 1950 census to kind of help us prepare for when it gets released. And we're going to discuss how to access 1950 census. It's going to be released on April 1st in 2022, so just in a little bit. And then I'm also going to demonstrate how you can prepare for the 1950 census, including how to find an enumeration district for your ancestor. And at the end, I'm also going to tell you, if you'd like to get involved with the U.S. Community Census Project, you can get involved with helping transcribe and checking what has already been transcribed. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. At this point, I thought we could just do a quick poll to kind of get some interaction here and hear from everyone. So Rachel, would you mind sending that poll through? So I guess I can't see the results yet. Can you tell me what we are getting so far?
Yes, we have 82% say yes and 18% say no.
Okay, so the question was, have you previously viewed any census records, either online, microfilm, or maybe you've even seen like a printout version of it? So basically, I wanted to see if anybody had experience, and that's great, because either if you've had experience viewing census records or you haven't, this class will be a good one to kind of learn more about what census records are. And if you've already viewed census records before, how the 1950 census is a little bit different. So I'm glad that we have a variety here. So thank you all so much for responding. So to start, let's talk a little bit about what census records are. So census records are basically an official count of a population, and they typically record details about individuals. And the U.S. federal census is actually required to be conducted every 10 years. And this is actually as required by the Constitution. And so the information that's collected in census, you may be aware, but it's not immediately made to public. So for privacy and things like that. So the first census was actually conducted in 1790, and we've had federal censuses conducted every 10 years since that. The 1890 census, unfortunately, was almost completely destroyed by fire. There's only a small portion that remains, but yes, so we currently have up to 1940, and in April, we'll finally get 1950. And that's due to the 72-year rule of why we have to wait until April. So basically, the U.S. government will not release personally identifiable information about an individual to any other individual or agency until 72 years after it was collected. And this rule went into effect actually in 1978. And so this restricts access to the census records to all but the individual named on the record or their legal heir. And so there's been times I've heard people say, well, why is it 72 years? And I've heard different theories about this. One theory I did hear, but there's actually no factual evidence that this is true, is that some people thought that that was the average lifespan at the time, is why 72 years. but that's more of a myth. There's actually nothing to really back that up. But if you want to learn more about the history of the 72-year rule, you can go on that link in the handout, and there's a blog post on the National Archives website, which gives a great overview of the history. So let's talk a little bit about some facts about what we are going to see in this 1950 census when it's released. So there's going to be over 7 million pages to the census. That's a lot of people being counted. And this is actually the first time Americans abroad were enumerated, and they were counted for the first time in 1950. And so basically provisions were made to count members of the armed forces, crews of vessels, employees of the United States government living in foreign countries, along with any members of their families that were also abroad. And several measures were actually added to try to improve the accuracy of the 1950 census. And so some of these include, they had improved enumerator training. So enumerator is basically the person that was employed to take the census, a census taker. And so they had improved training. They provided the enumerators with detailed street maps to their assigned areas. They even published missing person forms in local newspapers and to try to make sure everyone was counted. And the Census Bureau began using the first non-military computer shortly after completing the 1950 enumeration. So kind of a lot of improvements there. And then this is also the first census taken after World War II, which is kind of interesting. And then NARA, which is short for National Archives and Records Administration, is actually working on a first draft of index names. So this is actually a pretty big deal because this is the first time they've done this. So basically what they're doing is they're using artificial intelligence, AI, and OCR, which is optical character recognition. And basically what OCR does is it's going to identify printed or handwritten characters, and it's going to reproduce them in electronic form. So what they're trying to do is go ahead and have a first draft that's already indexed and searchable by name. Now, if you have looked at previous census right after they were released, like in 1940, everything was browse only for about 6 months because they were not completely indexed yet. But this time they're going to use some advanced technology here so that we can hopefully have a way to go ahead and search by name and search with using this new technology and not just have it browse only. So that's really exciting. I wanted to show you a little bit of an example of OCR and what this looks like. So this is actually just something I wrote earlier in my handwriting and just printed in ink. Here is an example of OCR. That's the first one at the top, and I just took a picture of that. And then I used a free app on my phone, which can do OCR and optical character recognition. And this is what it came out. It was not entirely correct. It says, here is an example. We kind of had a little bit of an error there with the L and then OCR, but it got most of it. But it will definitely be interesting to see with the type of technology that the National Archives is using, how accurate it's actually going to be, because it will be taking the indexing and all of this is going to be from handwriting. The census takers hand wrote everything. So what they're going to be attempting to do is something very similar to kind of what I did, is to convert this handwritten part at the top here into a machine text. So it's going to be interesting to see, because especially maybe some of the census takers didn't have the most neat handwriting, and maybe it's going to be harder on their pages for that to be as accurate. So that's just something to keep in mind. We're really not sure, but we'll talk a little bit later about how there is a plan for them to also revise later on too, if there are mistakes. So just a couple more facts. College students will be enumerated where they were living while attending school, so they won't be enumerated at home. And I like this little picture here. This is of 1950s of the census enumerator at a home of a housewife and with her 2 children doing the census enumerating. And this is from the National Archives. And like I mentioned before, enumerators did write down their responses to questions taken by hand. So you can see this man here, he is writing things down by hand. All right. I thought this was just kind of neat because I found some old advertisements that were put out during the 1950 census before it was before the census enumerators came around. And this one I thought was interesting because it says, "You can tell your right age to this gentleman," which is Uncle Sam. And you may be familiar if you've looked at the census before. I know sometimes I've found with my ancestors that you'll have maybe in 1930 they were one age, and then in 1940 it's like, wow, they only aged 2 years. Something's not adding up there. And maybe your ancestors were a little shy like mine about giving their actual age. So I thought this ad was funny because it's actually telling them, it's okay, you can tell the census takers your actual age and how important it was to give the actual information. And that is required by laws to answer all the questions and provide the information accurately. Okay, also wanted to talk about life during the 1950s. And here in this picture is a picture from one of our Sterling High School yearbooks from 1950 of some students there. So I added that for life during the 50s. But Harry S. Truman was president on April 1st, 1950. And there were 152.3 million in the US plus territories at the time of the census. The population had actually increased about 14.5% from 1940 to 1950. And at the time of enumeration, there were actually only 48 official states because Alaska and Hawaii wouldn't become the 49th and 50th states until 1959. However, those in Hawaii and Alaska were included in the census, and the 1950 census also included the territories of Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, the Canal Zone, the Virgin Islands of the US, as well as some smaller island territories. But the three most populous US cities at the time were New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And the war was over, and so the US experienced an economic boom. So to provide some context on this economic boom, the gross national product more than doubled from 200 billion to more than 500 billion between 1945 and 1960. And throughout the 1950s, about 4 million babies were born per year. So this is where we get the term the baby boom and baby boomers, as this actually started a few years prior in 1946. So these records will introduce us to a lot of those baby boomers during that era. And this was also the era that ushered in the civil rights movement, suburban living, rock and roll music, and various scientific innovations. So let's take a look here. This is the actual copy of the 1950 census form. And I also included a copy in your handout if you'd like to take a closer look here. But we're just going to kind of walk through some of the different sections on this form so we can get an idea of some of the questions that were asked. So before we do that, what can we really find out about our ancestors by viewing the 1950 census when it's released? So of course, we're going to get some biographical details. We're going to find out their age, birthplace, gender, race, marital status. And then we're going to get a lot of occupational questions on this census. So I'll get into that in a little bit, but they're very detailed. And there's also a section for some sample/supplemental questions where every fourth person on the census page and then every fifth person were actually asked additional questions. So we can really hope maybe that one of our ancestors is one of those that's in those sample sections where they got to actually answer a few additional questions, because that's kind of exciting to see if we have anybody who's going to have been able to respond to those. So this is kind of the first section, is just for the head of the household. And for these questions, we have some pretty basic ones, very similar to past census, name of the street, house or apartment number. And then there's also one called serial number of dwelling. So what does that mean exactly? So serial number of dwelling is basically, if you want to take a look, I linked the enumerators manual, like their reference manual, and it gives all the instructions that the enumerators were to have to when they conduct the census. And so basically in that manual, the instructions state to number the dwelling units in their enumeration district in the order in which they first visited them. And for lodging houses, each group occupying a separate living quarter that met the definition of a dwelling unit should be assigned a separate serial number. So that's a little bit of background on the serial number. And the fourth question is the house on a farm? And those who answered yes to the farm question would actually be required to answer questions on Form A1, which is the agricultural questionnaire. But unfortunately, that's no longer in existence and it will not be a part of the 1950 census release. And then question 5 is the house on 3 or more acres. And then question 6 has to do with that agricultural questionnaire. Okay, and now moving on to our next section. This was questions for all persons in the household. And so there's some very basic ones as well. Name, the relationship to the head of the house, race, sex, how old the person was at their last birthday. And then they asked some if they were married, widowed, divorced, separated, or never married. And then they asked what state or country the person was born in, and if they were foreign born, if the person was naturalized. Now we go to another section, and this section was just for those who were 14 years of age and older. And so this is when we kind of start getting into those detailed occupational questions. So the first one is, what was this person doing most of last week? Working, keeping house, or something else? 16, if the person was keeping house or something else. In question 15, did the person do any work at all last week, not counting work around the house? 17, if person answered no to question 16, were they looking for work? Question 18, if person answered no to question 17, even if they didn't work last week, do they have a job or a business? Question 19, if person was working, how many hours did he or she work last week? And then 20 is actually a triple part question, but it's just referring to the type of work they were doing. And now we get into that section, which is for the sample questions, which only a few people were asked. So 5% of the population would have been asked these questions. So on 21, the question is, was the person living in the same house a year ago? 22, if no to question 21, was the person living on a farm a year ago? 23, if no to question 21, was the person living in the same county a year ago? And then 24 is if no to question 23, what county were they living in? Or B, what state or foreign country were they living in a year ago? And then 25, what country were the person's mother and father born in? So I think this is a really neat part that I hope one of my ancestors got to answer, because then you'll get to know like where their parents were actually born as well. So for genealogy, that's really helpful. And then for 26, what is the highest grade of school the person has attended? And 27, did the person finish this grade? And 28, has the person attended school since February 1st? Now we move on to the next section of sample questions. Now these sample questions were only asked for those 14 and older. So let's talk about some of these. So for 29, if the person is looking for work, how many weeks have they been looking for work? So we're still getting into a lot of those occupational type questions. 30, last year, how many weeks did this person work? Not at all, not counting work around the house. And then 31 is another triple part question, and it's basically asking the earnings for the last year in 1949. And 32 is also a triple part question, and it's asking how much relatives earned in the last year. And then we also finally get a military question. So for 33, if male, did he ever serve in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II, World War I, or any other time? Now you'll notice it only is asking for males to answer this question, even though there were females who fought in the service in the war. So they are, depending on the enumerator and what judgment they made, they may not have asked the females because their instructions were to just ask males this question. Okay, and so for our last part of questions, this is for sample questions for people 14 years or older for the person on the last sample line. So this was going to be probably about one out of every 30 persons answered these 6 additional sample questions. And so for 34, this is just a direction to the enumerator on what to do. And 35 has a 3-part question again, which is the type of work they did in their previous job. And then 36 is if ever married, has this person been married more than once? 37, how many years since this person was last married, widowed, divorced, or separated? And then 38, the last question is, if female and ever married, how many children has she ever born, not counting stillbirths? So these are very detailed questions. We have a lot of occupational questions. We have a lot of information we can gather from looking at the 1950 census for our ancestors. So now I just want to talk a little bit about how can we best prepare for the 1950 census release? And so first, I kind of talked about this before we started the class, is to identify family members that you hope to find on 1950 census. So if you've already done a family tree or a pedigree chart or something like that, look through and see who is going to be alive in the 1950 census. If you haven't done a pedigree chart, this is a great time to kind of get started and do that and look at what family members that you are going to hope to find. And then try to determine the state, county, and even better, if you can know the street address where your ancestors lived in 1950. And some ways to do this is you can look at city directories. And so we have city directories available on our genealogy database with the library. It's called Heritage Quest, and that's free. And you can actually view it from home with your library card. And if you'd like more information on how to do that, I'd be happy to share after class. And then we also have Greenville city directories available in the South Carolina room. And the South Carolina room is located at the Hughes Main Library in downtown Greenville, and we're on the second floor. You can also look at newspapers to try to get information. We do have a lot of online newspaper databases, and we do have the Greenville News on microfilm in the South Carolina room. And a lot of our online databases are also available to be viewed from home with your library card. And then one of the best things to do is if you have some family who would have been, they're still living, who were you expect to find on the 1950 census, is just interview them, ask them where they were living, ask them what they can remember about that time period. And you might get a lot of helpful information that way. And then another thing that you can try to do is try to determine the enumeration district for your ancestors. And so for the enumeration district, basically the enumeration district, we'll go to our next slide here. It was an area that could be covered by a single enumerator, census taker, in one census period. And so usually enumerators were assigned one enumeration district. It could be several blocks in urban areas, or it could be an entire county in more rural areas. And you may be asking, is this really necessary, since the National Archives is working on creating this, they're going to use OCR, they're going to use AI to go ahead and index this and create that first draft. I think it's probably not as important as in previous years to find the enumeration district, but it will not hurt if you go ahead and find that. So, we're just not sure exactly how many corrections there will be needed to the OCR. So I would go ahead and try to find that enumeration district. So what we'll do in just a few minutes is I'm going to demonstrate how you can go ahead and find that beforehand. And that's just a great thing to have. You may not need it, but it won't hurt to go ahead and have that. And so what also happens is, you can see this little illustration is kind of showing how the census enumerators would go around a block. So basically they would begin each block at the corner. They would proceed clockwise around the block until they were back at the starting point. Now, if no one was home, what happened then? So households that were enumerated later are recorded on pages 71 and higher. So if you see and you're like, oh, it skipped to page 71, that's actually not a mistake. There's no pages missing. It just means that those people were not home when they first came by, and they were enumerated at a later time. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to stevemorse.org, and I'm going to show you all how to find the enumeration district. So if you have your handout, you can go to stevemorse.org. So Stephen Morse put together this really neat, helpful website. And I'm going to just do a couple of demonstrations on how you can find the enumeration district. So first thing to do is to go up to where it says on the left-hand side up here, US Census, and then hover over to Unified 1880-1950 Census ED Finder. ED is Enumeration District Finder. And it's already set up on mine to 1950 up here, but you just want to make sure your menu up at the top says 1950. And so I'm going to actually do two examples. The first example I'm going to do is more urban. I'm going to do one for Greenville, and then I'm going to do an example for a rural area because that's a little bit more challenging sometimes. So let's say I have ancestors that lived in downtown Greenville. And I'm just going to do South Carolina. So you just select the state. And I have heard that right before the census release that sometimes this website can kind of get overloaded. So I would recommend just kind of going ahead and doing that now if you can, so you can find the enumeration district. So just in case there's any issues with the website, you won't have to worry about that. Okay, I'm going to choose Greenville County. I'm going to choose Greenville. And now you can see I can put in house number, I can put in street. I'm going to put in, let's do North Main. Okay, let's see. Go, I think it's just going to be under, okay, Main, North Main. And then what you'll see is down here, I got an update with this little blue. I'm getting all these enumeration districts, but that's still way too many for me to have to sort through if I did have to browse through. So what I want to do is to actually choose another cross street or the back street. And so there is a link to a Google map if you wanted to look and kind of see, but just know that boundaries do change. And this is a current Google map that it shows you. But let's say we were looking at East Coffee Street. So my ancestors lived at North Main and East Coffee, let's say. Then you'll see that I now have the enumeration district is 23-50. So that's what I would want to write down and have it with me when the 1950 census is released, because I'll know exactly which enumeration district they should be in. And so once you click on it, it just tells you 1950 census pages will not be available until April 1st, 2022. So then it just takes me to this little page about what enumeration district that was. So I'm just going to go back. And now I'm going to do a search for one that's in a more rural area. I actually talked with my grandmother the other day, and I talked with her about where her family was living because I know she was about 13 and she's going to be on the 1950 census. And she was not quite sure about the city name. And she told me they didn't have street numbers. They were in a very rural area. And the county they were in, it doesn't even give me the option really for city or town. It just gives me other. I can type in some things, but what I wanted to show you is I can actually look at the exact maps that they had for the enumeration districts. So if I click on CED maps for Buchanan County, I'm going to click on that. And then it says get ED map images. And so now I get a link where I can actually view the enumeration district maps. So let's see if I can zoom in. And I've determined previously by talking with my grandmother, so this is a great idea to go ahead and interview family members and things like that. She helped me kind of narrow down which place that we think it is. So she mentioned she wasn't sure about the city, but she told me that Marvin, there was a Marvin post office. So I found Marvin on this map. She also mentioned Contrary Creek, that was nearby too. So I feel like enumeration district 14-4 is probably the area that they would have been in. So I'm really excited to see if I'm right when the 1950 census comes out. But you can see, like, you'll see very similar maps depending on the area, and you can go through and you can look at this by the actual map. And this is an actual map from 1950, so it's showing how it looked back then. But that helped me to try to determine that 14-4, that's my enumeration district that I believe I'm looking for. Okay, now let's go back to our slideshow here. Now that we've kind of done a little bit of practice with our enumeration district and finding that, and the instructions are in your handout as well if you need a refresher on that, on how to search. So we've talked a lot about how it will be available on April 1st, 2022, but how exactly are we going to be able to access the census? So it will be available via the National Archives and Records Administration's website. They are actually in the process of developing a 1950 census website that will provide free online access. But additional information is going to be forthcoming. We don't actually have a link to that just yet. So keep that, kind of looking into that. And on their website, there's actually going to be a demonstration the day before the census release on March 30th on the National Archives website, and they will actually do a demonstration of it. So that's on their National Archives 2022 genealogy series on the 1950 census. And then it'll also be available via ancestry.com and our library version of Ancestry, as well as familysearch.org. And familysearch.org is free. If you just, all you have to do is create an account with your email and then create a password, and it's free to use. And so how about if you want to get involved? So there's this 1950 US Census Community Project, and Family Search will be sharing how to be a part of this indexing process at Roots Tech in 2022. So Roots Tech is an online virtual conference this year. It's actually free. Usually if you go to Utah before the pandemic, you actually had to go in person, and it did have a price to attend, but ever since the pandemic, they've started making these sessions available online for free. So I did link that on your handout, and it's going to be March 3rd through 5th. So that'll be interesting to attend that and see what exactly Family Search is planning with the community project. And you can also find more information about this on the familysearch.org website. But basically, upon its release, the 1950 US Census Community Project is going to be a joint initiative between Family Search, Ancestry, and other leading genealogy societies and organizations that will coordinate efforts to provide quick access to digital images and create a comprehensive index that will be searchable online. So they are going to help ensure that an index is accurate. There's going to be reviews because, like I said, we're just not sure how the OCR is going to do, if it's going to be entirely accurate. We can expect there's probably going to be some errors, and we're going to have to review and make corrections. So if you'd like to be a part of this project, there's a link in your handout where you can register to participate. Okay, so that basically concludes our presentation about the 1950 census. I did want to mention just a few things before we get into our discussion. I did want to mention that if you're local, come visit the South Carolina Room. If you're not local and you're going to be traveling, feel free to pay us a visit. Like I said, we're located on the second level of the Hughes Main Library in downtown Greenville. And you don't have to make an appointment. That's not required. But if you would like to go ahead and make an appointment, we can go ahead and get things and materials pulled before you get here. So we always think that's helpful. If you know that you're going to be looking at a certain set of books or records, we'd be happy to get those pulled ahead of time. We also can do some online record requests and remote requests. And you can go to our website and view which requests we can do. And we have several resources in the South Carolina Room. We have books, maps, microfilm, photographs, and vertical files. So if you haven't been in, please stop by. We'd love to see you and love to share our resources with you. Okay, so I wanted to give us plenty of time to do our discussion and Q&A. So we'll go ahead and see what we all have in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen for just a minute. Actually, I think I'll keep the screen sharing going for now. Let's see. All right. See if we have any questions. Thank you, Rachel, for helping with those links. Yes. So Florence mentioned supplemental questions equal the long form. And Rachel shared a link to Heritage Quest that I mentioned and our resources. Yeah, the Steve Morse site, Laura mentioned, that's really cool. And I think it's just really neat that they put that together and that you have that tool. It's definitely fun to play around on. And I liked playing around just like in Greenville, but also for my ancestors that live in Virginia. It was super neat. And if you'd like to ask questions, you can unmute or you can type them in the chat. I'd love to hear if anybody's willing to kind of discuss what are you most excited to discover on the 1950 census? Does anybody have anything they're really excited to find out or to see? I know for me, I'm just really excited to see if any of my ancestors were chosen for that sample supplemental question portion.
Shauna, one of the great things I'm looking forward to is I'll be on there for the first time.
Oh, nice. That's exciting.
And Linda will too.
Nice. Yeah, we were talking with my family about who I was going to be on there, and they're all really excited to see. That's great.
Well, it's nice because my mother, father, of course, were already on there, but all four of my siblings, all of us will be on there at the same time this time.
That's great. Yeah, maybe you all had some of those extra sample questions asked. That would be neat to see if somebody in your family.
Yes, we would love to see that. We were talking about that when you were explaining. It'd be nice to be able to see those extra questions that were asked.
Absolutely. Fingers crossed.
I'll share that I'm really interested. I'm actually interested in the census from the perspective of my home address. I'm really curious to learn who has lived in my home previously.
Yes.
And I've been able to look at one past census. I can't remember what year it was, but I thought that those supplemental questions are so interesting. In the census that I looked at, I remember that they asked, do you own a radio, or do you have a radio in your household?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I know a lot of people like to that's a great point, is that you can also use it as a way to kind of trace who was living in your home before. So sometimes even for property records, people can use the census. So that's another way to use the census, which is really neat. Let's see, I think I had another comment in the chat. There's a question about, if you know one ancestor on the 1950 census, how can you go back further to see other older ancestors from that one? So we want to use the census as a tool, but we also want to look at other records too. So some clues you might have, let's say you have on the 1950 census and your ancestors listed on there, maybe they were in that supplemental sample question part where it asked them where their parents lived, and you might be able to say, hey, okay, they were living in a different state. Maybe I also need to look at North Carolina records or something like that. That might help you point in the right direction. Or if it shows like, oh, where were they born? Maybe you can look and see if there's any records, if they were born in a different state than when they were living in the census in 1950. You might be able to look at some of those records, marriage records, birth records. You can try to search for obituaries are really great. Usually if you have a family member, it will usually list oftentimes their parents, their siblings, sometimes grandparents, things like that. So news articles, things like that. So basically, if you find somebody in the 1950 census, that's kind of your starting point. Try to gather as much information as you can from that record, but then go explore some other records. So ancestry.com is a great place for that. Familysearch.org is free. And we also are an affiliate library location. So if you actually come to the library, you can access some additional records that you can't access from home. So that's really cool, but you can still access a lot from home for free. So I would just encourage you to look at all the different types of records that might be available and fill out your pedigree charts as best you can. And kind of when you see those gaps, kind of think about, okay, what information am I missing? What types of records might help with that? And if you're just getting started and you really like for someone to sit down with you one-on-one, we do have a Book a Librarian program here at the library, and you can come to the South Carolina room. And if you're not local, we can even do this virtually. We can set up a Zoom session or a phone call, and we can help you get started. And a lot of times we can send you some links and things like that. So if you're really just getting started and you just want to kind of get pointed in the right direction, a Book a Librarian is a great option.
I'm excited about education levels because I have some relatives that I've been told they didn't know how to read and write, and they had to quit school like in third grade, to work on the farm. So, you know, the 1940 census was too early to gather that information. So the 1950 will be the teller, you know, of you know, like I even have a relative that got a GED, and so it's like I want to know what grade they went to in school. So I'm real excited about the 1950 census. And that
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, my grandmother said she only went to the 8th grade, so I'm interested to see, because I think that would have been right around the time that was probably her last year of being in school. So I'm interested to see what we might see on the census about that. Thank you all so much for sharing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and go to our next couple slides here, because I did want to mention that we also have an upcoming genealogy drop-in program. This is a virtual program on March 19th at 10 a.m. So if you have any additional questions, or if you kind of are doing some of your preparing for the 1950 census, you know, research and things like that, and you get stuck and you have a question, this is a great place to kind of drop in, ask your question. We'll have sometimes 1 or 2 staff members there that can help you answer some of your questions. So that's a great opportunity. And you can go on our website on greenvillelibrary.org/adult-virtual-events to get registered for that. And we can also I can put a registration link for that in the chat, or Rachel, if you have it, maybe we can put that in the chat. And
Already
also,
there.
oh, you're so good, Rachel. On top of it. And also just wanted to mention to feel free to follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you have any questions, you can always email asklibrarian@greenvillelibrary.org. But thank you all so much for attending today. I hope you enjoyed, and hope to see you at our next event.
We do have one more question in the chat.
Oh, great.
How does
Okay.
knowing the enumeration district help me?
Okay, Sharon, that's a great question. So basically, it's going to be more helpful back when, like the 1940, everything was browse only, that nothing was indexed with the OCR. It took about 6 months for volunteers to index everything and make it to where you could search by name. So basically, in those situations, you needed to know the enumeration district so you could actually zero in on what record set your ancestors would have been in. So, you know, enumeration district, that was one enumerator usually went around as a census taker and only covered usually one district. And so if you figure out which one your family was in, you can go on and you could say, okay, I want to look at just this enumeration district and find those. So that was more helpful when, you know, before, when things weren't going to be searchable. And like I said, we're just really not sure how well that the technology is going to work and how searchable it's going to be. So if you can find out that enumeration district beforehand, that's still going to be, I think, helpful to you to kind of, if you did have to browse some of the images, you would at least know where to go, and you're not going to be searching through all the many, many different enumeration districts. Oh, yes. And so Rachel has linked to the historic handwriting video that we just did recently. Be sure to check that out, because even though that's covering more early style handwriting, it can still be helpful because we're going to be looking at some handwritten things on the census. So still, I think, helpful to check that out if you haven't viewed that video on our YouTube channel yet. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see y'all next time.
Okay.
Bye-bye.